Thank you, Paul. Like others before me, I say very sincerely, as I'm sure they did, what a marvellous 2 days this, well, it's not 2 days over yet, but congratulate, this is one of the very best of these kinds of things I've been to in the last 20 or 30 years. Last night, I'm afraid I was king hit by a cold that had been stalking me for a few days. I'm back on my feet now, but only just, so I hope you excuse me if my voice is rather croaky. As many people have lamented, racism is again on the rise in many parts of the world, and therefore so is an increasing failure of many people to see the full humanity of other people and peoples. So too are forces of dehumanisation. I can't remember an enemy in my lifetime so rather quietly, in a way, dehumanised as ISIS is now. Often corrupt forms of nationalism that show in responses to refugees and immigrants desperately fleeing conditions of misery, fear and degradation, though not necessarily because they are persecuted, as is evident in the thousands of people seeking better lives in Europe. Many people appear now to fear that perhaps within the next 10 years or so, national and international politics will be dominated by crises caused and inflamed by the shameful gap between rich and poor nations, aggravated by the effects of climate change. Deepening political instability in many regions of the earth may cause even more people to be uprooted than were uprooted last century. And strong nations are likely to protect themselves in ways that become increasingly brutal, testing the relevance and authority of international law. It is, I believe, almost certain that my grandchildren's generation will not be protected as we have been from the terrors suffered by most of the peoples of the earth because of impoverishment, natural disasters, and the evils inflicted upon them by other human beings. More and more, I fear, the reality of affliction, together with the reality of evil, will test their understanding of what it means to share a common humanity with all the peoples of the earth, and to agree, almost too awful to imagine, their faith that the world is a good world, despite the suffering and the evil in it. We are therefore under an urgent imperative to think again and radically, in the sense of going to the roots, about how to respond morally, legally and politically to the fact that mere luck ensures that some people enjoy the fruits of the earth, while again, because of luck, others suffer the humiliation and miseries of the damned. As increasingly and perhaps brutally Western nations are forced to acknowledge right into the bones of their political cultures the extent to which their troubles are the result of their colonial adventures, that question will become unavoidable. Well, obviously I can't even try to answer it seriously here, but I want to sketch a kind of conceptual landscape in which one might try a conceptual background which I hope will be of some use to the panel discussion after me. But first, some thoughts about the idea of a common humanity, what kind of universality is implicit, what supports it, what might undermine it, and what its implications are for a richer conception of a the national interest, or the concept of a national interest, when we see that morality not only constrains the pursuit of that interest, but becomes an integral part of our very conception of it. Well, it's striking how often we speak of humanity in ethically inflected registers or ethically resonant tones, as when, for example, we speak of seeing or failing to see the full humanity of peoples, of dehumanization, or perhaps of living a life that's not worthy of a human being. And connected with that, it's striking how often we speak of our humanity as not something given to us once and for all, as species membership is, but something we have to rise to for the rest of our lives. It's just unending. I think, in fact, that's what Socrates meant when he said, under threat of death at his trial, that he couldn't give up philosophizing because, as he put it, an unexamined life is not worthy of a human being. if you substitute for unexamined and the philosophical method that Socrates had, and in fact substitute a concern for lucidity, then I think that becomes true and not as arrogant as it first might otherwise appear. Well, be a human being for once in your life is evidently not an injunction to be more fully a member of the species Homo sapiens. And Socrates did not mean that an unexamined life is not worthy of the species. He's not a monster, he's a human being, is not a reminder that a terrible wrongdoer has not forfeited his species membership. We see, I think, we see the natural location from which the ethical inflections on the way we speak of humanity derive, if we reflect on a distinction between human nature and the human condition. I think of human nature as revealed to us in experience, corrected and deepened by the sciences. Claims about it are characteristically empirical claims, and when there's non-collusive agreement about them, certified by a community of relevant scholars, usually scientists of one kind or another, they find their way into textbooks, encyclopedias, and sometimes earn Nobel Prizes. Reflection on the human condition, by contrast, is on the meaning we human beings have made of the big facts of life: birth, death, sexuality, our vulnerability to misfortune, most importantly. It's also a reflection on what we are to make ethically of the discoveries of the sciences, how we should take them into our lives. Reflection of this kind makes no groundbreaking discoveries. In fact, the concept of a discovery in anything like the way it applies in the sciences is for the most part alien to it. Aristotle's writing on biologies are now of only historical interest, but for as long as we are educated, we'll consider, engage with, and learn from what he said about ethics, politics, and tragedy. Ditto for Socrates' affirmation that it's better to suffer evil than to do it. And I could produce a very long list of artists of various kinds and philosophers of whom this is true. Thinking about them requires, of course, conscientious attention to relevant evidence of a factual kind. It requires that we think logically, patiently careful about how to move from one thought to another, but it requires also that we develop an ear for tone, for what rings false, for what is sentimental or has yielded to pathos, and so on. The development of such a critical sensibility is not optional in reflection about the human condition, indeed about anything that really matters ethically. Without it, we lose our subject matter, and without it, reflection on ethics in all its manifestations isn't worth a cracker. Earlier, I said that the requirement to make human beings of ourselves has no end. It's not one that some of us could fulfill more quickly than others, perhaps because we're smarter or in other ways better at it. And then I was making a point about human beings as individuals. The same is true, I believe, of human beings in various forms of collectivities. Even in its collective use, humanity is, as one might put it, a verb. That's an expression I owe to Greg Denning, who, when he reviewed my book, A Common Humanity, said for Gaita, humanity is not a noun, it's a verb. The humanity that we affirm when we speak of the common humanity of all the peoples of the earth is not fixed, is not a discovery upon which we could settle, upon which reflection by the peoples of the earth could converge, as we hope it will, on scientific matters. And this is a point of considerable importance for politics. I'll discuss it first in connection with national politics and turn later to international politics. It's uncontroversial that Australia's Aboriginal peoples think differently about what it means to be human than do non-Aboriginal Australians. The difference can be described most generally as lying in their attitude to the natural world and to their place in it. That's vague, of course, but it's enough to sustain the point that the difference has inevitably shown itself politically in, for example, disputes and court rulings about land and title, and in the many, sometimes angry arguments about what counts truly as reconciliation as opposed to merely symbolic gestures towards it. Perhaps the most bitter disagreements were over whether genocide was at least sometimes in some parts of Australia committed against the stolen generations, as bringing them home alleges. Understanding of the wrongs committed against the Indigenous peoples of this country obviously depends on an ethical understanding of what they have suffered. Understanding of that can never be too distant from their stories and other forms of art that express that suffering. If that's so, then it's obvious that for the most part, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples of this country do not have a shared understanding of that suffering, and therefore of how it should inform the ethical characterisation of the wrongs and crimes against them. Ethical characterisations that make those wrongs and crimes what they are. Given their ethically different conception of what it is to be human, how, for example, should the Aboriginal peoples understand the idea of a crime against humanity, if the concept of humanity plays any serious role in the ethical characterisation of such crimes? The development of such understanding between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples, one that truly is shared, that truly represents an understanding that's in common between us, would be unnerving, radical, again in the sense of going to the roots, and would almost certainly be novel to the classical tradition of Western political thought. And for that to happen, non-Aboriginal peoples must come to see what is at issue from the perspective of the Aboriginal peoples. And that requires more than we usually mean by empathy, because it depends on acquiring new concepts and modifying old ones. Those concepts will determine the character and content of empathy and compassion. They will not be its products. If one is not to hope that compassion and empathy can do things that it cannot, then it's imperative to see that the nature of compassion and empathy is always a function of the concepts under which we respond to other people's sufferings or see the world as they do. Victims of injustice often suffer physical and psychological trauma, but they also suffer the injustice of its infliction, which is often an irreducible focus of their torment and of their need for the justice that is done to them for the injustice that was done to them, to be acknowledged in the spirit in which the physical and psychological damage is ameliorated. Apology, forgiveness, atonement, punishment, these are appropriate responses to that resentment and that torment. Compassion and empathy must be informed by that realisation. No one can say what would happen were we, that is to say, in fact the we now is that I'm speaking as it were non-Aboriginal populations. Were we to understand better how Aboriginal peoples experience the crimes committed against them, and therefore how that understanding should inform the ways that Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples will be able to say we truthfully and justly in political fellowship. It might not be we Australians, and I think that's something we have to be open to. I turn now to international politics, or more precisely to the place that the idea of a common humanity should have in international law, and the importance of such law to the ideal that the peoples of the earth might form what could honestly be called a community of nations. The moral of my discussion of the relations between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians is that when we acknowledge that racism against them is a denial of their full humanity, we should not think that implies that we now fully acknowledge their humanity, that we know what the ethically inflected sense of humanity comes to in our relations with them. Rather, we must together, rather than unilaterally, see what we can make of the differing conceptions of it. And we cannot assume that in the end, if only we're patient enough, sensitive enough, generous and attentive enough, we'll agree. We might not. And we'll then have to see what we make politically of that fact. And ditto, I would say, for international politics. Token acknowledgement by the nations of the earth, as they are represented in the UN, of international law, and sometimes their opportunistic use of it, has disguised how little real agreement there is about the ethical content of what it means to commit, for example, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and even genocide. I doubt that there's much that could truthfully be called a shared understanding of the ethical content of the preambles to major instruments of international law. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948, states in its preamble that, quote, "The recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world." End of quote. Many other preambles to important instruments of international law speak in the same language. The Convention Against Torture, for example, speaks of the inalienable rights that derive from the, quote, "inherent dignity of the person." And these preambles suggest that the idea of the dignity of humanity, of a dignity that one possesses simply by virtue of being human, underpins the concept of an inalienable right and is fundamental to an elaboration of what it means morally to violate such a right. The moral character of crimes against humanity is often rendered as an offence against the human dignity of those who suffer them. It's now almost second nature to us to speak of human rights and the dignity that's been offended when a person's human rights are seriously violated. The concepts of inalienable dignity and inalienable human rights, as we use them, are clearly of European origin. Indeed, the resonances they carry for us are the heroic resonances of Kant's moral and political philosophy. That's not of itself a bad thing. Cultures have existed in which there was not even a hint of those ethical concepts, and cultures now exist which regard them as absurd. Absurd to think that Saddam Hussein was owed a fair trial for his sake, rather than because it might place the integrity of the legal system on a slippery slope. That an imperative so sublime as the one that requires us to respect the humanity of even those guilty of the foulest crimes should show itself in ways as prosaic as observing courtroom procedure might seem paradoxical. It might make us complacent, forgetful of how wondrous it is that humanity should ever have come to such an affirmation. In much of my work, I've tried to reclaim a sense of such wondrousness, to create the right conceptual space in which it can find an authentic and compelling voice that can answer someone who says, if you want to be treated like a human being, first behave like one. The people like Saddam and many of the fighters for ISIS are vermin. I must add, though, that I would not trust someone who affirmed that even such people possess inalienable dignity to which we owe a respect that is unconditional, unless they were tempted to believe, as many people do, as Churchill, for example, did of the Nazis charged at Nuremberg that they should have been shot in the street like rabid dogs. But I dread the prospect of a world in which my grandchildren can no longer affirm, for it is an affirmation, an act of faith that reason and science can't secure, that even the most terrible evildoers, those whose characters appear to match their deeds, who are defiantly unremorseful and in whom we can find nothing from which remorse could grow, are owed an unconditional respect, are always and everywhere owed justice for their sake, rather than because we fear the consequences if we do not accord it to them. Nonetheless, though criminal governments have sometimes shamelessly responded to criticism of their conduct as being Western impertinence, the protestations that talk of human rights as a Western imposition on the ethical traditions of other cultures sometimes has point. Indeed, one could say that the way we now speak of human rights has paradoxically made it difficult to identify the deepest of our ethical reasons for inventing the idea in the first place, that indeed, rather than supporting the idea of a common humanity, it undermines it. I suspect that many of you will find that too paradoxical even to be intelligible, so I'll try to explain why I say it, seeking help from Simone Weil, a French philosopher who died in 1944 at the age of 33. In a slightly unfair polemic against the moral importance we accord to human rights, she says, I quote, "If someone tries to browbeat a farmer to sell his eggs at a moderate price, the farmer can say, I have the right to sell my eggs, keep my eggs if I don't get a good enough price. But if a young girl is being forced into a brothel, she won't talk about her rights. In such a situation, the word would sound ludicrously inadequate." End of quote. The reason Ray says it would be ludicrously inadequate for the girl to protest that her rights had been violated is not because it would be pointless to do so, although of course it certainly would be. It's because she believes that the concept of rights is of itself inadequate, incapable of itself, to take us to an understanding of the moral terribleness of what the girl suffers. Imagine someone who said, "My God, look at what that brute did. He violated her human rights." That could capture almost nothing. It would sound like a parody. What's terrible is not that her rights have been violated. What's terrible is that she has been violated. I hope that I won't be misunderstood here. I'm not suggesting that we banish talk of human rights. The battles for human rights and for the acceptance that all the peoples of the earth share an inalienable dignity that defines their common humanity have been amongst the noblest in Western history. God only knows where we would have been had we not fought and won so many of them. However, talk of human rights needs to be embedded in, to draw on, to be richly mindful of, and always take us back to a richer vocabulary that reveals what it means ethically for a person's human rights to have been seriously violated. If we rely on the concept of rights to do much of the ethical work alone, we will uproot it from its source and find ourselves ethically illiterate in the characterization of the terrible wrongs that people suffer, that, as the phrase human rights suggests, should be of concern to all human beings by virtue of the fact that they are human beings. Then talk of rights will undermine rather than support the hope that the peoples of the earth will acknowledge their common humanity and the profound ethical implications of that acknowledgement. We'll undermine the prospects of the kind of conversation between the peoples of the earth that would give us reason to hope that we could become genuinely a community of nations, made such by rendering ourselves answerable to international law, at least in regard to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Just as a sense of fellow national feeling is sentimental unless it's supported by the institutions of justice that show that it matters to us that our fellow citizens are wronged and that wrongdoers remain our fellow citizens, justly held to account but never banished, so the idea of a common humanity will be empty, as will the ideal of a common community of nations, unless people in all nations show a concern for the grievous wrongs done to peoples of other nations. Admittedly, the sense in which such a community exists is very thin at the moment, but it's not meaningless. The ethical core of the concept of crime against humanity, I suggest, should be that they're crimes against the constituency of humankind, crimes that must be of concern to all human beings in their capacity as political beings. And that, as I said earlier, is a precondition for the existence of a community of nations answerable to international law. They're crimes of concern to all human beings for whom it matters that their political identity is partly formed by the fact that they belong to a community of nations. As I said earlier, racism and ugly forms of nationalism are again resurgent in many parts of the world, including Australia. Who would have believed even a couple of months ago that 49% of Australians would ban Muslim immigration? And who could doubt that the figure would be much, much smaller if most Muslims were white? Some Australians are ashamed of this, of our cruel treatment of refugees, and of course of our treatment of the Aboriginal peoples. Shame is an interesting concept when applied to national politics. It's a way of acknowledging responsibility for something that one has become caught up in, even though one may not be guilty by deed or admission, although of course one may be. The shame felt by many Australians is of a kind that presupposes that their identities have been formed by their attachments to, often love, of the country. They express that identity when they say "we" to express national fellowship, rather than merely to record the fact that they belong with other Australians to a national group. Such people for whom shame is a painful form of love for, rather than a reason to reject their country, try to awaken in us, their fellow citizens, an acknowledgement that we share a common humanity with refugees and their families, and to make such an acknowledgement inseparable from the we of national fellowship, hoping that most Australians will embrace rather than resist the fact that Australia will belong to a community of nations only when it's answerable to international law. Conservative politicians speak more often of love of country, of pride in what the nation has achieved and what our soldiers have done to protect the national interest than politicians of the left. Talk of national shame, however, and worse, the suggestion that our soldiers, like the soldiers of all nations, should be answerable to international criminal courts, is anathema to Conservative politicians. But by the same token, the refusal of many on the left to take seriously the need that most human beings have of roots realised in national forms has been one of the reasons, I believe, for Brexit and the development of right-wing national paranoia more generally in other parts of the world. Because the left generally has not been prepared to take seriously talk of love of country, feeling it will always decline into ugly, often murderous forms, it hasn't taken seriously the question, or questions. How can we prevent love of country from degenerating into jingoism? And what kind of road can we build on which jingoism might find its way back to love? The obligation to think hard about this is fundamental and urgent because the need people have for roots and their protection by military force will not go away anytime soon. And the reasons go deep. Here's Simone Weil again. Quote, "We owe a cornfield respect, not because of itself, but because it's food for human beings. In the same way, we owe respect to a collectivity, a country, a family, or other, not for itself, but because it's food for a certain number of human souls. One sack of corn can always be substituted by another sack of corn. The food that a collectivity supplies for the souls of those who form part of it has no equivalent in the entire universe." Real love of country can be identified by at least two markers: by the desire to love truthfully and by the desire to love without the shame that would be the only truthful response to the wrongs done on behalf of the nation by our leaders or in time of war by our soldiers. Because it fastens onto something that is inevitably a mixture of good and evil, love of country is always a mixture of gratitude, pain, sorrow, pride, shame, and sometimes guilt. In the circumstances that make them appropriate, each can be a form of love of country, just as severe criticism of one's country can be a form of loyalty to it, and the desire to love without shame and without lies, a form of concern for its welfare and for an enriched conception of the national interest. Well, it's a truism that international law that constitute the nations of the earth as a community of nations must express values that are in some sense universal. It's natural and common to think that the universal values expressed in those laws are principles that can be abstracted from the cultures of the nations answerable to those principles. Those values, this thought continues, could be, and ideally should be, expressed in a language that consciously disengages from the local, historically conditioned associations and resonances of natural language. But there's another way to think of universality. We see it if we reflect on the fact that understanding of what it means to commit and to suffer the crimes prohibited by international law is often deepened by art. When a film, a painting, a play, a novel, or a poem, for example, moves us, art provides a different model for universality than does science or political or moral philosophy that would seek universal principles abstracted from the concrete circumstances of peoples who are intellectually and spiritually nourished by the way they've been rooted in this or that culture. "Every writer needs an address," said Isaac Bashevis Singer, "even if it's more than one." That's a fine way of putting the point I've been trying to make. Great literature potentially speaks to all the peoples of the earth. That's one of the reasons we call it great, but only as translated from one natural language into another. That's not because we've been unable to develop a single universal language, as some hope to do with Esperanto. It's because that's the kind of universality that are appropriate to the content of literature, content which often can't be separated from its form, and whose form cannot be separated from the contingencies that have nourished particular cultures, particular forms of living, particular natural language. This vital mediums, they call them. Only in such mediums, in the natural languages distinctive to them, can we properly elaborate it, what it means ethically to violate someone's human rights, to commit crimes against humanity and crimes of war. Thank you.